Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning to get the first detailed look back at our 2023 greenhouse gas emissions. As Mary Frances has highlighted, we're going to be giving some broad overview and key messages. I'll take you through some progress towards our national and EU targets, and then our agriculture and inventory lead, Bernard Hyde, will take you through a more detailed sectoral summary. So in 2023, when we exclude land use change and forestry, our emissions were 55 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. And this is the first time in 33 years we can say that our emissions are below our 1990 baseline. It is also one of the largest step down in emissions we've seen of 4 million tonnes outside of a recessionary period. So there's quite a lot of room for positivity here in terms of what happened in 2023. Like that, this wasn't isolated to any one sector. So the largest single year emission reduction was seen in energy and in agriculture. And it was also the second year running where we saw a record low level of emissions in the residential building sector. Transport did increase, but marginally so at 0.3%. And we're still currently below our pre-COVID levels by 4.3%. In terms of our first carbon budget, we're 3 years into a 5-year budget, and we have used 64% of that budget. So again, there's an acceleration needed for us to meet that first carbon budget. And in terms of our EU commitments, we have a 42% reduction by 2030 based on 2005 levels. And under the EU effort sharing regulation, in 2023, our emissions were only 10.1% below our 2005 levels. So again, still some quite distance to target there. More specifically, as introduced by Laura, again, within energy industries, of that 4 million tonne in total, 2.2 million tonnes were as a result of reductions in the energy sector. And this was largely driven by that 12-fold increase in importation of electricity, which ultimately meant that 9.5% of our electricity supply in 2023 was via importation, but also an increasing share in the renewable sector. From 39% in 2022 to almost 41% in 2023. In agriculture, again, we had this single largest annual change of reduction of 1 million tonnes or 4.6%. Again, this was largely due to a reduction in fertilizer use and also a reduction in liming. And again, our inventory lead, Bernard Hyde, there will go into more detail on that. In terms of the residential sector, again, for the second year in a row, we've had a record low level of emission from this sector, and it itself also dropped by 7.1% or 0.4 million tonnes from 22 to 23. Like that, there's been an ongoing move away from the use of fossil fuels for heating in this sector, but it has been accelerated by the higher fuel prices and a milder winter in the latter half of 2023. As I mentioned, transport, there was a marginal increase of 0.3%, but this put in context of a 6% increase seen in 21 and in 22. Our emissions are still below our pre-COVID levels by 4.3%. Overall, in terms of our national ambition of a 51% reduction by 2030, in 2023, including LULUCF, our emissions were 7.8% below our 2018 levels. So again, we're aiming for a 51% reduction by 2030, so still quite some distance to that target. So here is the full time series, the overall trend in emissions broken down by sector from 1990 to present. And this is the first time again that we can say that our emissions are below by 1.2% our 1990 baseline. Again, the first time in 33 years we can say this. Again, the annual change in emissions isn't very obvious there, but much more obvious in this next graph, where we can see that 4 million tonne single year reduction in 2023 and a reduction of only a similar magnitude that would have been seen within recessionary years of 2009 and 2011. So there's quite a lot of room for positivity that we can see that level of reduction, but outside of recession. In terms of the sectoral share in emissions, 38% of our emissions are from agriculture, 21% are from transport, and 14% are from the energy sector. As you can see from the graph on the left-hand side, some sectors have been able to decarbonize more rapidly than others. So again, going to transport in 1990, it would have been 9% of our emissions, rising to 21% of our emissions in 2023. In contrast, our energy sector would have been 20% of our emissions in 1990 and are now less than 15% of our emissions. And again, for the first time ever in 3 decades, that bar on the right-hand side by 2023 now represents emissions that are slightly less than that bar in 1990. But this decarbonization across particular sectors and overall reduction in emissions is in the context also of a growing economy and a growing population. So in 1990, there would have been 3.5 million people in the Republic of Ireland, and now there are almost 5.3 million people in the Republic of Ireland, meaning that our per capita emissions have gone down by almost 35%, from 15.9 tons per capita down to 10.4 tons per capita. In terms of where that puts us in our ranking in Europe, we currently don't know because the 2023 European per capita emissions data won't be available until the Q4 this year from Eurostat. What we can do is look back at last year and look about where we ranked in Europe. And we were third behind both Luxembourg and Iceland in terms of our per capita emissions, and still quite some distance above the 7.85 European average. But again, if our emissions are down to around 10.4, our ranking will hopefully drop to maybe 4th or 5th, but we won't find that out until Q4 this year. In terms of our national ambition of a 51% reduction by 2030 on 2018 levels, in 2023, our emissions were still only 10.1% below the 2018 level. So as I was saying, quite some distance to target there to make it to 51%. In terms of our interim targets and our carbon budgets, we are now 3 years into the 5-year carbon budget from 21 to 25, and we've used 188 million tonnes out of the 295, so 64%. When we look at these budgets broken down across sectors, and here they're not called budgets, they're called sectoral emission ceilings. Again, being 3 years into a 5-year budgetary program, we would like to see all of these figures below 60%, and they're not. In that case, for some sectors, it will be far more challenging to reach their emissions targets than others, particularly the larger sectors or those sectors that are still struggling to decarbonize. So to communicate that annual change needed to bring all these different sectors to within their sectoral emission ceilings by 2025, that's what the next slide effectively communicates. So these are the annual reductions needed for each of these areas, for each of these sectors to reach their sectoral emission ceiling. So at a national level, that's the top line of the 8.3% reduction. When we include LULUCF, our step change, even though it was an excellent year and we dropped down by 4 million tonnes, when we include LULUCF, that equates to a 3.8% drop in emissions from 2022 to 2023. We need that to be 8.3% in 24 and 25 for a sort of a linear trajectory for us to meet our first carbon budget. Across different sectors, clearly some have a steeper hill to climb than others, but two immediately jump out from this graph. So the residential building sector. In this particular sector, it has exceeded expectations and exceeded its indicative percentage reductions within this first carbon budget, to the point where technically it could actually increase its emissions by 2.1% in 2024 and 2025, clearly something we wouldn't advocate. So, but it's just to show the success of the sector and its ability to decarbonize. Again, that is in the context of two sort of warmer winters in succession. And if we do have a cold winter, again, that excess might decrease, but still it's present and it's a positive to see. In terms of agriculture, unlike in previous years when we would have communicated this, now only requires a 0.1% decrease in 2024 and 2025 for it to meet its sectoral emission ceiling. This has been due to an improvement that we've applied to our agriculture inventory in terms of an updated sheep and beef methane model. In this instance, when we applied this update, emissions came down. Our updates sometimes can actually increase emissions, but in this, the emissions came down. And from 2018 to 2023, this removed 8.5 million tonnes from our agricultural inventory. So again, my colleague Bernard Hyde would be the Agriculture and LULUCF inventory lead. We'll go into that in more detail in his section of the presentation. But it ultimately means that agriculture, it is now much more achievable for agriculture to meet its sectoral emission ceiling. In terms of our EU commitments and a 42% reduction in 2030 on 2005 levels. The red bars there identify our annual budgets, or in this instance, they're called annual emission allocations. And it is within these budgets that we're aiming to comply to reach that 42% reduction by 2030. So the blue bar, if we look at 2023 specifically, is our emissions. And so with this additional flexibility, that sort of little orange bar at the top there, flexibility is a mechanism within the effort sharing regulation where member states, it supports member states in achieving compliance. And under the emissions trading scheme, we have a 1.9 million tonne flexibility that we can add to our annual emission allocations to support compliance. In 2023, we still exceeded our limits by 2.3 million tonnes. But cumulatively from 21 to 23, we effectively banked around 500,000 tonnes of carbon above and beyond our limits in 2021. And cumulatively across these 3 years, we still have a net distance to target of 0.15 million tonnes. So we're still just within compliance of our effort sharing regulation targets. So there ends my element of the presentation. I'd like to hand back now to Mary Frances to continue. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tomás. And now we're going to hand over to Bernard Hyde,